The final item that we'll deal with in the open agenda is the social housing one. Yay. And sorry, it's in a it's a late paper.
You've got that recorded?
Right.
You wanted us to make this today?
Okay. Thank you, Bruce. Do you want to introduce the paper or does Glenn want to introduce it? I asked for this paper to come straight to council because I didn't want it to go through the committee to the council. I just think it's we need movement. Yeah.
I could provide, if you wish, some brief comments there and then to Bruce.
Well, which is more quick and helpful?
Go straight to Bruce. I can be quick and helpful too. No, look, but just taking...
That's very generous of you.
That's all right, into account the last matter.
Social housing has constantly caused this council and previous council's issues. We've got a big job to do and we are restricted in funding. The latest of the issues we're trying to deal with is improving warmth and dry, improving the quality of life for our tenants. And council has asked us, or the housing subcommittee has asked us to bring forward to you some options to accelerate that program. And we've tried to do that within the restrictions of the current policy settings that we face, both at the national government level and within council as well. So these are in front of you. Essentially, there's three to look at. One is we do this within the dollars of the housing fund, which would take this out to 2022 and doesn't really significantly accelerate the program. Secondly, we could look at borrowing to move this forward. We believe that this is viable, but because of the acceleration of getting this report together, we haven't done the final checking of the financials, which is why we would be suggesting in the recommendation that we bring this back again on the 12th once we do the final checking. And the third was looking at, there's a risk with some of this that we throw good money after bad, and that some of the units are better closed and we accelerate redevelopment. And there's another paper that's coming to you in September that's coming from the Housing Subcommittee, which puts some ideas of how we can accelerate growing our social housing, and that will include the question of, rather than just growth to meet future demand, is lower growth, but some of that related to replacing some of these older and cold units faster than we would have planned. So that's really the gist of this. There is a fourth recommendation that we've put forward. Sam, can you add that fourth one in? And that's basically to say that we will work very closely with the Housing Trust to deliver this work. We'll align programs so that we can get both the best in timing to get the work done, but also the best value for money outcomes as well. This is something that we're happy to commit to achieve, and the Trust and I are already having those discussions. There was one question that came up this morning from one of the deputations, just regarding getting information out to the tenants. We'd agreed with the Trust to do that a little while ago. That work is close to completion. In fact, talking to one of the staff, Mr. Hardy, today, he indicated he expected to go out either today or tomorrow, that information. So that is going to be
each unit, I mean each block explaining where they sit and what the proposals are?
They won't have proposals, but where their current status is, we
Right.
will follow up with proposals once we get that detail in place.
Yeah.
So I'll stop there, given the lateness of the day, and answer hopefully a small number of questions.
Yeah, no, that's extremely helpful, and I really appreciate you adding the commitment to integrate the two programs, because these two programs have to go hand in hand. That's how we're going to get the best outcomes for as many people as possible. I'll get Glenn, Yanni, Andrew.
Thank you, and thank you for your hard and speedy work, Bruce. So just to double check the process, by virtue of proceeding with these recommendations, we are essentially giving effect to option 2, which is to get it done. So it's a contiguous approach with the detailed so this, despite it saying September 12th, it doesn't, you actually begin the detailed delivery work.
I've got a planning meeting with the Trust on Monday to work through the acceleration towards December. So we're working on that basis, but we cannot presuppose Council's decisions. We won't do that, but we'll work on getting planning to accelerate this as fast as possible.
Right. But you'll hear the signal today, so yeah. Thanks.
Yep. Yanni?
Yeah, I was, given that it's coming back next week, and on the 12th of September, and you've got a meeting next week, surely the direct communication should hold off until we get that program confirmed. Otherwise, we're just going to have to communicate in 2 weeks' time or 3 weeks' time.
No, as I said before, the communication that's going out is about the current status of individual units in terms of insulation. And the second, which I think you're referring to, will be about how we will go about addressing those matters. That can certainly, that'll have to wait because we don't have that in detail yet. But at least we give that information to tenants. The concern that seemed to be expressed this morning was that tenants just didn't know what the status of their properties were. Now, some do because they'll have got that in their tenancy agreements, but there are others, particularly long-standing tenants, that feedback hasn't been provided to. So we're providing that feedback.
Isn't that status going to change based on what we decide on the 12th of September?
We can't change the past, no.
Sorry, because some people that currently aren't in line to get insulation upgrades may be in line to get insulation upgrades based on what we decide on the 12th of September.
We have committed already, based on Council's policy, so it's not a Council decision, but you have a policy about warmth and dryness. We've already publicly committed that we would do this work anyway. So we'll just reconfirm, and we'll check that whether that message is in the Trust's messaging. We reconfirm that we are committed to doing this work. Your decisions today are about accelerating it. They don't change the status of the insulation that's currently in a unit, which is what we're providing.
So when it comes back to us, just so I'm clear, there's no units that we're not going to insulate that we're going to decide to insulate?
The aim, there may well be some choices that have to be made through the program about whether or not insulation is the best use of money. What we will do is improve warmth and dryness, and that will look at initially, as the paper sets out, getting improved heating in there, which is most likely going to be heat pumps, and improving the mechanical ventilation. Then there does need to be some discussion on some units, whether you keep on pouring more money into them or whether you're better to pour the money into replacing them and putting new units up and closing them in the interim. Right. Those are discussions that will have to happen through the program.
And are we going to get several quotes?
Yeah, Andrew.
Thank you. Option 2, if we were of a mind to support option 2, and you've acknowledged already there's some detail that's lacking. I mean, I guess things that we would want to see would be what the cost of the borrowing would be. Have you given any thought to what the effect, and I mean, in the grand scheme of things, even though it's a large amount that we're looking at, it's a relatively small amount in terms of Council's overall budget, but effect on debt to equity ratios and debt headroom and those kind of things?
No, I need to have those further discussions with the finance team.
So
on
if
that.
we were of a mind to support option 2, what sort of a resolution would you want today in order to be able to bring that detail back to us so that we could then confidently support option 2? Because I don't think we've got that information at the moment.
Yeah, I think the resolution in front of you does that, because that possibility of borrowing to bring forward will cover all of those aspects.
Yep. All right. So as long as we'd be confident that you'd bring it back with that kind of detail,
Yeah, yes.
and even with some detail around, there would be other works that would be deferred because of the cost of borrowing, a sense of what the prioritisation would be, what the deferral of works would look like, and maybe even the opportunity to input into, what we're willing to wear by way of deferrals in order to get the speeding up of this work.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
All right. Great. Thank you.
Bill?
Thanks very much, Bruce. Just the concern about with the end of the life cycle of these units and the possibilities you referred to it by putting good money really into bed. When we get the the paper on growing social housing, will that give us a steer as to how we can avoid perhaps the worst excesses, if you like, of possibly repairing or some of the old social housing, so that in fact money is not wasted?
Yeah. So the paper that you've asked for on the growing is a conceptual one on a model of how we can utilise the current context that we are in, which is low interest rates and where there is government opportunities that provide long-term funding that meet all the costs, including all the interest costs. So that we'll be putting forward. In terms of the question you're asking, what we would look at is what might be some targets, and we've previously presented a broad indicative target of 500 units over the next 10 years. What we would do is then indicate, well, rather than if we didn't achieve 500 new units, what would be the mixture of new and replacement units that we could sensibly provide in the next 5 to 10 years, and work that through to see how we can use that to improve the quality of the portfolio.
Thanks, Bruce.
Tim?
Thank you. I'm just concerned in the sense that historically, and we don't want to look backwards, but we've built by numbers rather than, it seems in some areas, quality in respect to the tenants, because Braham Street, etc., always leaked and were cold and hot and da-da-da. So, but when we're going forward from now on, we've got a group of people that are in council housing that is substandard with regards to heating and insulation, etc. So yes, we have a current stock which we've got to replenish because we've got a shortage of housing. We've got some that can be retrofitted with heating and insulation, but you're saying that we've also got a group which you've got to really look at carefully, or we've got to look at carefully with regards to, is it worth? So technically that's the group that we would be looking at to phase out, as in demolish. But in the meantime, we have people living in those conditions is unacceptable. So has it been looked at slowing the new build down to fix the old problems while we then move forward?
So the suggestion in the report is that even for those where they should be redeveloped, we should get in and do something about improving the heating and the ventilation. I think in the report it says we should aim by beginning of next winter to have done that in those units. So we'd be working on that basis, and it's most likely to be heat pumps. In terms of the new growth, Council's not doing any at the moment. It has made a decision to fund the trust, to finance the trust by way of a $30 million loan for them to build some. They're at such an advanced stage that I don't think it would be sensible for us to change our direction around that 30 million loan. And I think that they can certainly help some of the immediate problems, because we could look at whether there's a possibility of some closures and the difficulty here is we can't guarantee that if we close that those tenants would move into those new units because it's all based on need. But if the current units were closed, they will have a higher need automatically.
So is there also kind of a secondary question, as we should be working hand in hand with the trust, which we are, and thank you for your work with that, is there a possibility that, you know, with their build, they will be putting heat pumps in their new build, that we can go hand in hand with them, say, well, they're building so many at 30 million, we're retrofitting, could we hit up and do a bulk buy and with refitting?
We already had that discussion, so yes, yep.
Dion?
You just wanted to ask, is the assumption that we're making that we're keeping all of the units in the ownership of the council or the trust on these decisions?
To a certain extent, I have, in the advice to you, I've just assumed that we're agnostic about the ownership, that we want to improve the quality regardless of whether they remain with council or they're ones that we have transferred or are about to transfer to the trust.
But what about like ownership between the two entities? So we're just assuming that either one of us will own it, then we're not selling any to redevelop or to reuse capital to redevelop and those kind of things.
You'll see from the report that that was an option that was looked at, but suggested was not feasible at this stage. And my computer's gone to sleep, so I need to reopen it. But I think that the reasoning I put for that was that that was something that council would probably want to look at a consultation process before it went down that path. And if you went down a consultation process, that would not achieve your aim here, which is to accelerate the program.
Yep. So that's all the questions. Raf?
Yeah, thanks. Can you just explain to me, I mean, our housing policy from 2016 calls for secure, safe, affordable, warm and dry housing, and yet it seems for some time we've been housing people in substandard, barely habitable conditions for quite a long time. How has that happened?
Quite simply, we have focused on the numbers, the quantity, rather than the quality. The constant
your policy.
Sorry?
You've breached the council policy. Yes, you have. I mean, it's been a complete
One of the
failure.
things in the report talks about that you've got quite a number of different objectives, or we jointly have a number of objectives regarding social housing and housing. And it can be challenging to achieve all of them. And the quantity versus quality is certainly one that is challenging, especially in the constraints of still maintaining affordable rents and not having any rates funding coming in there. So it's very much a significant balancing act. With the focus on those that are not warm and dry, the old and cold and wet, we do sometimes miss the fact that the majority of the portfolio has had significant improvements over the last few years, whether it's through the installation of insulation or whether it's through earthquake repairs, and we've lifted them. And there are quite a number, and some councillors who came on a field trip with us last year would have seen some of those complexes where the improvements have been made and we've lifted that quality. But you're right, we have not achieved that across all of the portfolio. And under current funding of accumulating the funds to get to there, it would take us at least to 2022 just to meet the healthy home standards and the insulation standards for the exempt properties. This is one way of accelerating that.
But is that acceptable? I mean, this is a pretty basic thing. I mean, we hear constantly about the importance of housing being a basic human right. And we spend money and we get money for all kinds of things all the time. which don't seem to be as important as this, and we're allowing these people to live in appalling conditions. I mean, shouldn't this be a top priority?
It's probably not a question to ask
Why not?
staff, it's a question to ask
Why not?
ourselves.
Well,
It's
because
our
he's giving advice.
responsibility.
Is it?
It's collective responsibility, that's right.
Well, I don't.
So, I mean, I think you're getting a sense around the table that people want to move on this, and we do want to prioritise it, which is why I asked the paper to come directly to council and not to sort of waste it, well, not waste, but not to delay it any further by putting it through the process or the track that it would otherwise be on. But you are coming back to us by the 12th of September, or to the 12th of September report to the council meeting, so that we can really look at how we can get on top of these issues. But I mean, it is a challenging issue, because the balance, I guess, that sits in behind this is that, you know, in some instances, some of these places are not worth keeping, and how we're going to knock them down and build new is going to be an issue for displacement in the interim. So we really do need to make sure that we've got a pipeline, but people do need to be looked after. I really took on board what was said this morning about, you know, just the need for even a simple heat pump would actually provide relief, financial relief, and also provide a warmness and dryness that would be definitely preferable to what's currently there. So yeah, I mean, that's the trouble, Ref. It's just getting into the issue, which we have to ask ourselves the question of. Yeah. Have you got? Is this questions, or are we going to go into the debate?
Before we go into the debate, can we resolve to continue?
Oh, sorry. We need a resolution to continue beyond 8 hours. Now, the decision is in your hands.
Happy to
Tim,
move if the mayor buys pizza
seconded.
for dinner.
Seconded by, no, I've got a meeting, I'm sorry, I'll be leaving it in Andrew's hands in a minute. Seconded by Phil, I'll put that motion. All those in favour say aye. Aye. Those opposed say no. That's carried. I'm actually not going to do that to you, Andrew. Yeah, we're all in the same boat. Okay, so so there are other questions to do with the report?
Just to check, like when you come back on the 12th of September, are we going to get additional options for funding other than just borrowing from the housing portfolio? So things like use of the endowment fund possibly. I know the question about whether we should contribute rates or not, maybe capital acceleration fund or approaching central government.
Most of those options are in this report already, particularly in those that were considered but weren't feasible. If you wish to add some more, we can certainly do that, but I just draw you, it's not a lot of time, there's a lot happening, and if the aim is to accelerate the program, I think it would be good to have a straight steer now, and we can just get the key matters back in front of you.
Yeah.
But if it does, if the borrowing doesn't work, for whatever reason, on the 12th of September, then I don't want to be stuck without an option to actually do this. So we will have sufficient advice on the 12th of September.
When you couple it with the advice that's
bring it
already
back.
in the paper, that would be sufficient
Okay.
to
And
make
can I
a
just check the
decision.
final question I had is in terms of, are we going to get different ways of doing the installation? Like, are we going to get different quotes or different processes and look at the cost effectiveness?
We're not going to make micro decisions around the table. We're actually authorising staff to get on with a program, and that will be decided on the 12th of September.
Right, but surely we'll get options in that program about the degree of what we want to go to, the double glazing, which was one issue that was raised, and how we do it in the most cost-effective way.
At that operational level, we will definitely be looking at those things.
Yeah.
I probably wouldn't be looking at reporting all of those up, but I can keep you informed as we adopt different methodologies.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay, Andrew.
Thank you. And my point really picks up on, my question really picks up on the point that Raf made. I mean, I guess the answer to Raf's question really is because we're constrained by the amount of funds that we've got within the housing fund, and we've got a policy setting which says that, you know, the housing fund is what pays for improvements to and maintenance of and anything that happens within social housing. So if we did get to the point that Yanni has just described, where option 2, which is borrowing going to fast-track the programme wasn't workable, or as you worked that up, it became obvious that there were things in there that were likely to be unpalatable to councillors. At what point would you begin to think about making recommendations of changing those policy settings, or on a temporary basis doing something that was outside of policy to get us over this particular problem that we've got in front of us at the moment? Because, you know, there is a strong degree of public interest. I'm hearing comments around this table that I perhaps haven't heard so widely expressed before. Maybe the time's right for a more... for just lifting this up and dealing with it differently, even on a temporary basis. At what point would you start to consider alternatives that would be outside of policy, or put that in front of us for consideration?
Yeah. So the social housing strategy review will be a matter that will be coming to the council early in its first term. The preparation work is well advanced, and it's something that would be good to come to you in the first few months, but I'm not sure exactly where the timing is on that. And that will look at that broader question of those policy settings. I think if you were looking at a temporary one, a temporary departure, excuse me if I just bring up, because I did make some comment on that, and that was one that was a live option until mid-Sunday afternoon.
I mean, certainly you've done the right thing to work within the policy settings that we as a council have created and confirmed. But there may be a point at which we would reconsider that. Obviously, there's an opportunity coming up in the next council for that to occur. Yeah. But we may, just listening to Raf's comments, we may have reached a point where we want to do something at least temporarily more quickly than that.
Yeah. So if you look on page 7 of the report, I'm not sure what the page is on yours. It's the second dot point in 5.2. So in terms of getting a quick report through, what we considered was that a temporary departure, it's something that council could consider at the moment, but we'd need to look at trying to find an existing project elsewhere that could cancel to free up the funds. So that option is very close to being a feasible one, as long as we can resolve that, and that would be a matter, I think, if we got at the next report to say, hey, the borrowing doesn't work, that we could start on. That gives you, probably need another report at the end of September identifying any projects that could be cancelled to release that funding, that rates funding.
All right. Now, does anyone want to move the recommendations? Glenn, seconded by Phil. Any discussion? Glenn?
Okay, thank you.
Or do you want to close off the debate? Oh, okay. No, started it.
All right. Okay, if I really think I need to close it, I could say something at the end, but I'll try and absolutely get it now. Our 2,200 unit portfolio is one of contrasts, just to pick up what Councillor Manji has said. So in several cases with our new builds and those we've facilitated through OCHT, those units are actually, because of our decision making and policy, built to Homestar 6 standard. Many in the new builds in the private market are only Homestar 4, which is the default setting in the building code. We're dealing with these today, as we know, as we've heard from one of our tenants this morning. 8 degrees in summer is not tenable when the World Health Organisation guidelines are 18 degrees minimum, 21 degrees for elderly and infants. New Zealand's average is 16 degrees in our housing stock across the country. We've been voluntarily insulating our units prior to the legislation coming in. These are dealing with the exemptions. We may be technically exempt, but obviously we're facing a moral question. We're not morally exempt from doing this. We're dealing with recommendations today that are taking us along a parallel path with further detailed financial information to come. I think that is reasonable given the situation we find ourselves. I applaud our tenants in terms of this inherently kind of democratic process which they've invoked in coming forward. I think that is wonderful. It could have greater ramifications from this too. This accelerates the improvements and brings greater consistency too with the housing policy. So move.
Thank you. Sorry, Yanni and Dion. Phil.
Yeah, I strongly support this. The questions have been asked why this hasn't been done before now. Just want to go through. We had a housing accord where I tried to get this addressed with government. The housing accord really didn't deliver anything in terms of quality, which is a real lost opportunity. Obviously, we thought we would get income-related rents for our housing, and the government reneged on that, and we ended up having to set up the trust. So I think the trust is doing work around insulation, and they have got additional money coming in through the rental process. But fundamentally, this council has put up social housing rents for years and years and years and over the last decade, and we still don't seem to be getting on top of this problem. So I think we do need support from central government. I've always maintained that we should have had an agreement with central government like Wellington City Council had of hundreds of millions to upgrade our social housing, and that would have helped alleviate this. But the other thing is, I think it's about us as a city and what our priorities are. And, you know, like we have opportunities to have put money on budget for our social housing, which we've rejected. We are funding developers in the central city, for example, of apartments that are worth hundreds and hundreds of thousands of dollars. We're giving a rates contribution to that, but not to our social housing. And we've got people living in the condition that they're living in. It is not acceptable. We need to do something about it. And I strongly support getting this report back and taking action. Just in today's report, we've got money from our endowment fund being spent on recreation and sport, community centres, surf life saving, and $100,000 artwork. And yet we've got our social housing tenants asking us to support getting decent insulation to live in proper standards of housing. So my view is we need to do this. It has been a long time coming. We need to get on and do it. We need to make the priority as a city that this is important, and I welcome that opportunity on the 12th of September.
Thank you. Dion?
Yeah, I was going to say something quite similar. That the thing that really peeves me off the most about this is actually the gold plating of many of our assets that we've built since the earthquake. We've had some very nice architecturally designed community facilities, and you know, that's fine. But actually, for the health of the city, you've got communities, you've also got people living in your city, and they make up part of these communities, and their assets are their home. And so I think it's a shame that we've got to this point, and if we can reprioritise some of that money to put into what I believe is an asset, a home for people. So I think, you know, we look at the whole thing quite in the wrong way about it. But it does actually make me think about what is the actual purpose of the homes that we have, and do we need to own them all? And is there a better way of doing it? Because I don't say shame, because the point that I have here is if the city is going to own properties, what's the point in owning shit properties? They're not good enough for people to be living in. We need to get them redeveloped. If we can't afford to do it, somebody else might be able to afford to do it, whether that's the government, another trust, I don't know. But we have to really think hard about this, because we're not going to get this done by the time, or all of them. We've just heard some warnings here. We do have some debt ceiling issues around doing these things, and we need to think about this seriously.
Phil?
Clearly the key point today is, you know, we have got a lot of people in our council housing where they are not warm and the units are not dry, and clearly that is impact on their quality of life. And I think in many ways this report has kind of like shocked us as councillors. I actually do find it shocking, even though I've been aware of these issues for a long time, like other councillors. So, and the issue has been referred to by earlier in the discussion, that the reason for this is that our social housing in Christchurch has got a long history of actually being underfunded in terms of the maintenance and actually renewals and building sufficient social housing. And I guess while our council for years has tried to keep the rents affordable, but we know there's been, the policy is we do not have any rates, money to contribute to add to this, so here we are. We also know that in fact there hasn't been a government subsidy apart from the times when this housing was built. And we're still explicitly excluded from getting the government's income rent relates subsidy. So, and we know that historically the funding always came from government subsidies. So, and I am urging everybody, and I think we will today, support this option of borrowing to make amends really. Because it is something that we as a council can simply do and get on with it, to provide warm and dry shelter for some of our most vulnerable. And we know that what is currently happening is that their health, both mental and physical, is being seriously affected. I actually think there's probably not one of us here in this room who cannot put hand on heart and feel some sense of shame that this has been allowed to happen. You know, almost all of the residents in our social housing, they have a family, usually in Christchurch. And many of you, and I have too, have been contacted by members of those families. In a way, they provide the acid test for all of this, is if we had a family member, a mother or a father or a sister living in these conditions, we would feel very disillusioned. So, you know, and I think today we had a challenge from Steve, who made his deputation, and I think if they were honest about whether we would offer to live in these conditions, none of us as councillors would put our hand up. I wouldn't either. So I think this increasing the borrowing and following the borrowing option, that is actually a drop in the bucket compared to what we need to do to actually meet people's basic human rights. And so we must get this issue fixed as soon as possible.
Tim.
Thank you. First of all, I'm going to start with thanking Bruce, you and your team. You've been going on for some years with regards to coming up with different ways outside the box with the Housing Trust, etc. And you and your team have done an outstanding job. And you and your staff, like us, have inherited a headache. That headache was this council has been building social housing at the minimum level for some time. It's not a new thing. We all knew when we were kids that like Brahma Streets and others, they leaked, they were cold, they were hot. It's appalling. So now we've got to get on and do it, but we do not want, and I'm totally against taking it from rates, because we have to maintain a social value for all communities and all levels of those communities in our city. So I totally support the borrowing for this, and that loan is self-funding through social housing. This should have been done 20, 30 years ago, or when we started social housing, and it wasn't. We've got to get on it, we've got to do it properly, and I think, Bruce, through you and your staff, with that level-headedness and the conscious effort to get it right, to the respect of those living in these conditions, is the right way to go forward. So I would support the loan option. You know, we can't go to the government, because why would the government give it to us, any assistance to us, when we're the ones that built the problem? Thank you.
Andrew.
Thank you. I think this comes down to, and the points have been well made around the type of homes that some of our tenants are living in, and the way that they're having to live as a result. And this really comes down to what kind of a city we want to be, and what kind of a society we want to live in, and what our influence over that is. And then that comes down to more practical issues around tensions between providing a number of units, and we've been under some pressure to restore the number of units back to what it was pre-earthquake, and the quality of those units and the way that they're operating. And then what was described earlier as throwing, you know, good money after bad, where we're keeping some units going for the sake of providing the numbers, when actually what we're providing may in fact be substandard accommodation. And there are some real tensions there. But I mean, Dion made the point earlier, it's a pity that we've got to this point. It's a shame we've got to this point, and it is. But it's great that we're now having a well-informed discussion about it, and that we're planning to have an even better informed discussion on the 12th of September. My instinct is to support option 2. But we don't have enough detail to know whether we can support option 2 or not. Again, the comment was made that, you know, we've got some debt ceiling issues. Well, this may or may not lead to that point. We don't know yet because it's not in the report. It's likely that the bigger issue is going to be the affordability of the borrowing within the housing fund and the compromises that we're going to have to make around the other work which is planned using that same money if we've got interest payments to come out of that housing fund which is already significantly constrained. So there will be some difficult decisions to make when that report comes back on the 12th of September, almost certainly. And one of those decisions may well be whether we can achieve what we need to achieve or want to achieve within the housing fund, or whether there's some other options that we need to look at. And I think that's a good discussion for us to be having. I'm very keen to see ways that we can work more closely with the Housing Trust to get the benefit of having that organisation, and how we can look at working together to bring about a better result for our tenants. But actually, I think what we're looking at here is the efficiency and appropriateness of 2 lots of policy settings, one of which is government policy settings around the IRRS, and clearly there's some work there that we would encourage been speeded up. Local Government New Zealand have already taken a position on this by way of remits, and also the possible need to revisit our own policy settings, and I think an acknowledgement that there's an increasing degree of urgency around these things, because the results that we've got for the people that are living in our social housing is becoming more and more apparent. We need to do something about it. I welcome the report coming back on the 12th, and we must do that at that time.
Thank you. Brad.
Yeah, I mean, for me, it's quite simple. If council is going to be in the provision of housing, it needs to do it properly, and it needs to do it to the standards that it sets itself. And if it can't do that, it should let other people do it. I mean, that's pretty simple. And if this, the policy really, which seems to have snookered the housing section, if that's not working, you need to look at it and you need to make some decisions. But you cannot have people living in that kind of condition. I mean, that's the bottom line. It's about an outcome. The guy who came in today, he doesn't care who owns his house. He just cares that he's living in an icebox. That's it.
Yeah, I wasn't going to say anything, but I will, because I also want to thank staff for the work that they're doing, and I really want to endorse the approach of integrating your work program with Otautahi Community Housing Trust. You know, the reason that we set up the Otautahi Community Housing Trust was so that we could access the income-related rental subsidy. But I'll tell you what, it's a much better concept of having the trust able to develop relationships on the ground and to really focus on social housing. And integrating the 2 work programs, I think, gives us the opportunity to get more bangs for their bucks. I think when councillors take up responsibility for chairing working groups and committees, then it's really important that issues like this are reported back to council for decisions in a timely way. Then things don't build up into this sort of situation. When I was the MP for Christchurch Central, which is admittedly going back a very, very, very long time, Haas Courts were the jewel in the crown of the council units. They were comparatively new at the time. They were fantastic. People were queuing up to go into them. And it is a shame to see, to hear the submission today. And what we're signing off on today actually gives us a mechanism for getting at least decent heating in there in the meantime and enabling us to resolve the issues. But I think, you know, everyone has to take a leadership position. I notice people don't actually take collective responsibility for things that aren't perhaps quite right, but I'm always required to take collective responsibility, no matter what. So what do they say? That there are many friends with success and not very many with failure. and this does represent a failure on a number of levels. You can cast your blame across any process, but this has given us a mechanism for resolving what is not right. So yeah, I appreciate very much the work that's being done. So on that note, I shall put the motion. All those in favour say aye. Aye. Those opposed say no. That's carried.